My name is TJ VanToll, and so I've been a web developer for about a decade now, so quite a while, but I'm actually fairly new to the hybrid Cordova world. I got started with it around 2012, so about 2 years ago. And 2012 just happened to be not the greatest year for hybrid, at least from a PR perspective. So a lot of bad press from the likes of Facebook's and LinkedIn and others as well, abandoning kind of the web-based app development libraries. But I think a lot of us in this room tend to scoff at these type companies, like, oh, they didn't really understand how to build real web apps. But there was actually a lot of very legitimate reasons behind these abandonments. So if you look at the write-ups that these companies put together, you'll see a very common theme. Tooling comes up a whole lot, that it was really hard for them to detect performance problems. It was really hard to detect memory leaks. And the tools that they had available basically paled in comparison to what was available in a native world, in a native iOS or Android world. Now, I can certainly sympathize with these companies because this was my personal debugging framework from around that time. And I see some of you are familiar with this approach to debugging apps. And there were some tools in 2012, don't get me wrong. We had things like JS Console, we had things like Winery, but these really paled in comparison to the desktop browsers that we really wanted to use to develop our apps. But the thing is, times have really changed. 2 years have went by, and hybrid tooling, or the tools that we have available, that ecosystem has completely exploded. Now, I know this firsthand because, first of all, I work for a company, Telerik, that produces a lot of these tools, but I also work as a developer advocate, which means my job day in, day out is not only to know Telerik's tools really well, but just to keep an eye on the industry, see what kind of tools are out there for people to use. And I can tell you that in the last 6 months to a year, that has went from craziness to absolute absurdity. And so I go to events like this, and occasionally I get some very interesting questions. This is one I happened to get about a year ago now, where somebody asked me how ChemUI Mobile, which is a Telerik UI framework, compares to chocolate chip. Now, I didn't have a very good answer for this individual because my brain immediately went here. But as it turns out, chocolate chip is a dedicated framework for building hybrid apps, which I consider to be actually a really big deal, that just the fact that we have dedicated UI frameworks. When I started building hybrid apps, I would use the same web technologies, the same frameworks that I used to build my mobile web apps, which of course works, it's all still the web, but there are some very specific considerations that go into building a hybrid app. Performance is paramount, so building things like fast scroll animations, accounting for the 300 millisecond click delay, building really optimized view transitions, and little things like display, making sure your app doesn't like shift around the screen. These are very important considerations. And having frameworks that solve these problems essentially for you frees up our time so that we don't have to solve these problems all over and over again. We can just concentrate on building our apps. And so I mentioned chocolate chip, and there are several other good UI frameworks as well. You may have heard of Ionic they were mentioned yesterday. They're giving a talk, I think, later today. Really beautiful hybrid UI framework. There's Onsen, which is kind of a new one, and that I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. And as I said, at Telerik, we have ChemUI Mobile, which if you followed the product for a while, you may know that it used to be a paid product. We made it completely free and open source about 6 months ago. So if you want to check it out, head to github.com/telerik/ChemUI core. And if you want to just kind of play around, see what the library looks like, we have a quick little Reddit viewer at cuteness.io that you can check out. So those are UI frameworks. That's one thing that I consider to be a big deal, at least an improvement to what we have for tooling available. Another big one for me was bringing some of the features that I really love from the web over to hybrid apps. And that's really the refresh button. I know that as a web developer, I could hit Command-R in my sleep. It's kind of built into me in terms of muscle memory. And so when I first started developing hybrid apps, I really wanted that functionality available for my apps, but of course there is no just simple refresh button available. But there are several tools that are now starting to address this. So we heard about the PhoneGap developer app earlier. This is one perfect example of it. It's just an app that you install from the App Store, iOS, Android, and Windows Phone. You start a little server on your development machine, and it'll automatically watch for changes that you make to your web code and push it out to the apps running on your devices. The Ionic folks recently unveiled a feature very similar called Live Reload. Basically, you add a -- live reload flag or -L flag to the run or emulate command. Works very similarly where they push out web code. They don't have the dedicated apps that the PhoneGap developer apps, how those work, but they do work in app packages and in the emulator. At Telerik, we have our App Builder product, which has a live sync feature. Works very similarly. You change your web code and see it rendered on your iOS, Android, or Windows Phone device. Our live sync feature works both through companion apps, which you can download from the App Store. You can search for App Builder. But it also works on true app packages, so .ipa, .apk, .xap files that you've deployed to your device. And this is kind of cool, and I'll show an example of why that's really kind of slick in just a minute. But that's my second tooling improvement. The third one on my list is related to Cordova. And this one is especially interesting to me because personally, I don't really like seeing code like this. How many people have written code like this before? It's a number of people. So I find that I used to write code like this a whole lot. And I would do so because really I still want to test, or I still want to use my browser's developer tools, the Chrome desktop dev tools or the Firefox developer tools to debug my app. I really don't want to use these kind of remote debugging solutions. And so I write code like this to kind of work around the fact that Cordova is not available. But the thing is, doing so kind of limits what's possible in your app. You kind of shut yourself out from using Cordova as a core part of your app or as a core part of your workflow. But it's really widespread. So if you use Ionic at all, you may be familiar with the Ionic serve command. It's it's a nifty command that basically enables that exact same workflow, where it fires up a little server, runs your app in the browser. And it's really nice for being able to use your desktop browser for your Cordova app. But one downside is they even mentioned in their docs that when you're running in the browser, Cordova is not available. So you get in this situation where you have to write code like this to kind of work around that situation, and all of a sudden you're in a little bit of a mess. So a number of things are being done to address this as well. So first of all, at the Cordova level itself, the browser has been added as a platform. So you can do Cordova platform add browser, and then your Cordova implementation actually will work with some of the core APIs. So for instance, if you call navigator.getPicture because you need a picture in your app, if you have Cordova as a browser attached, your laptop or whatever device you're using will prompt your camera to grab a photo. Now at App Builder, we take this a little bit further. We have dedicated simulators that actually implement all of the Cordova core APIs, so the 15 or 16 in the list, which is, in my opinion, kind of slick. You're seeing the simulator there on the right-hand side of the screen and the Chrome Dev Tools on the left-hand side. The Chrome Dev Tools work because our simulators are actually built on the Chromium embedded framework, so they're using Chrome under the hoods, so you have the ability to tie into those. But your core Cordova APIs are still going to work. So if you fire off a Cordova dialog, you'll see a custom-made mocked implementation within the simulator. If you need to get the camera, the simulator will prompt you for a file input to avoid having to fork your code and to still use this Cordova workflow. Now this is still just a simulator, right? So this isn't the real deal. It's kind of a mock implementation. And what I found personally from my own workflows is that with advancements to remote debugging, which we'll look at momentarily, and kind of this live sync, live reload type functionality, I find it's really powerful to just get my app as a true app package and develop there tied into this live sync functionality. And I want to give a few examples of this. So this is one I was playing with the other day in App Builder. I was just kind of curious how the status bar API worked. So I just built an iOS app, installed a .apa file, turned on live sync, and just started playing around with this. Now, in my opinion, this is really damn cool. And the reason it's cool is because this is actually faster development than I would do if I were developing a native iOS app. Like developing through Xcode, it would actually take me longer to kind of iterate through this code and figure out what I wanted to do, which in my opinion is again, pretty slick. And what gets even cooler when you wire up multiple devices. So for instance, I wanted to see how Cordova dialogues worked. I couldn't remember what alert versus confirm versus prompt. I was kind of confused about that. So I just wired up live sync on 3 devices, started playing around, saw what happens. Gives me a great little way to test my app. Now speaking of Cordova plugins, there's a lot more of them than there were a year or 2 ago. So as of last week, there were 422 listed in the store. There's probably more now. But there are other marketplaces as well. So at Telerik, one thing we wanted to do is we wanted to create our own little Cordova list of plugins, and ones that we personally verified, went through and did things like make sure each plugin has a description, has detailed API documentation, has screenshots of what the plugin looks like on multiple platforms, has some version history, tells you what platform is supported. And most importantly, each of the plugins in the ecosystem is completely free and open source. So you can use it with Telerik products. We'd love if you use these plugins within App Builder, but they're just Cordova plugins. So you can add them to any Cordova app that you have. And so as an example of this, earlier this month, I was playing around with an Ionic app, and I just wanted to add some sharing abilities. So I wired in our social sharing plugin, which is quite the tongue twister. But the plugin has methods like share via Twitter, share via Facebook, share via email, share via SMS, share via WhatsApp if you're into that sort of thing. And it's really kind of nice because you're not importing some like JavaScript-based control like a tweet button or a like button or something like that. You're actually tying into the metal, the native sharing widget available on these devices. As another example of this, we have an action sheet plugin, which if you use, for instance, CandyUI Mobile has an action sheet component, Ionic has one. I believe it's a pretty common thing for hybrid UI frameworks to use. If you're using this, you should probably consider just using the plugin and using the native code, the native widget that's already available on the OS. I mean, doing so means you don't have to ship some sort of JavaScript implementation, and it also means your app will just naturally feel more at home in a native world because you're using the native components. The last one I'm going to mention, and this one's kind of slick, is our new native page transitions plugin. And this one, and it's kind of self-explanatory from the picture, there are flip and slide methods available. And then we also, I think, newly added a drawer one for iOS. But actually, like the engineering details and the way this works, I think is really kind of slick. So you can pass this plugin an href property, say like #page2. And what the plugin is actually going to do is it'll take a screenshot of what it's currently looking at, put that screenshot front and center, it'll do the navigation behind the scenes, so take you to #page2. And then the transition you're actually seeing is taking you from the screenshot to the newly navigated view. And hopefully from this GIF you can see it's usually fairly seamless. There's some logistics within the plugin to try to make that interaction as smooth as possible. And it's configurable too, so you can change things like the delays being used and the directions and things like that. We even I just saw this the other day, we now have an adapter for CandyUI Mobile, so you can add a little JS file and on your CandyUI Mobile app automatically switch to use the native transitions within your app. Now I don't have time to go through every plugin in the marketplace, but I would encourage you if you do one thing today, just go to plugins.telerik.com, take a look through the list, see if there's anything that you can utilize in your Cordova apps. Again, they're completely free and open source. You might need PayPal or Stripe integration, maybe you need background audio or calendar integration. Go out and go there and check a look. There's even a button where you can request new plugins for us. So if there's something you're interested in having, let us know. It's good feedback for us. That's the third tooling improvement, and I'm almost out of time here, but the last thing I have to mention is remote debugging, because personally I consider this probably the single biggest improvement to tooling we've had in the hybrid world. Now, iOS remote debugging has been around for quite a while now. It was first introduced in iOS 6, but Chrome is actually fairly new. There was kind of some bastardized workflows for Chrome in older versions of Android, but Android 4.4 and its switch to a Chromium-based web view brings essentially the full Chrome dev tools available to debug your apps, which is actually, I consider, supremely important just because it pretty much directly addresses those concerns that we saw from Facebook and LinkedIn at the beginning of this talk. If you want to debug performance in your app, well, the timeline view of the Chrome dev tools has an FPS meter that you can track over time. And actually, I should give a shout out to the Firefox OS guys who, at their workshop yesterday, showed me they have a similar thing, except they'll show the FPS directly on the phone, which I thought was kind of slick. But FPS, pretty cool. The other big one, if you'll remember, LinkedIn specifically talked about this a lot, was memory tooling, which is also available on the timeline view within the Chrome DevTools. So you can monitor your memory over time. You can explicitly request garbage collection runs and see how your app reacts to it. And if you really want to dig in, you can go in and overwhelm yourself by taking heap snapshots and record heap allocations over time. But it's not for the faint of heart. So I don't have time to walk through all of these tools, so I put together a few links that can kind of talk about the things I've talked about, so things like walking through those Chrome DevTools features, walking through remote debugging if you haven't done that sort of thing before. There's a few steps. It's not as intuitive as it probably could be. I'll be tweeting out the links to these slides so that you can get at these links and you can refer back to this later. My name is TJ VanToll, so if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me at Twitter. Feel free to grab me around. I'll be around all day. And so thank you.
That was awesome, dude.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, we have a minute if you want to answer a couple questions.
Sure.
I totally recommend checking out Telerik stuff, though. It is really, really nice. Page transitions plugin is also pretty sweet. Any questions, TJ? Oh, Tommy's got one. What's up, Tommy?
Yeah. Yes. Correct. So the question was about requesting new plugins, and absolutely, like if you have a plugin that's out there that you want to be better, or you just want completely new functionality, if you go to plugins.telerik.com, there's a pretty visible link that says like request. It's pretty easy to find, and just give us that feedback, and encourage everybody in here. You know, the more votes, the better. Yeah. That's the live sync functionality in App Builder. And so that'll work even with deployed .apk files.
Is that open source?
No.
Oh. Well, that's what you were thinking, right? Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. I was watching the demo and I'm like, I want that. Thanks a lot, TJ.
Thank you.
So next up.